So thanks for joining so late in the day. So this panel is looking at the politician Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but more broadly, what her popularity in fame means for America. So in 2016, a not well-known senator from Vermont, professing to be a socialist, called Bernie Sanders, became an unexpected second favorite, at least, to winning the Democratic Party nomination. Since then, we've seen the election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Congress, another professed socialist becoming an international superstar in the process. Meanwhile, a slew of other more left-wing Democrat Party members have risen to the fore. So this session, I hope, will look at what's behind the rise of AOC, that's the acronym used for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and other similar politicians in the US, and what it tells us about the future of the Democrat Party and America more broadly. So to join us, we have, on my immediate left, Dr. Albena Azmanova, who's an associate professor of political theory at the University of Kent, and the author of The Scandal of Reason and the forthcoming Capitalism on Edge. Next, we'll have Kate Andrews, who's an associate director of the Institute of Economic Affairs and a columnist for City AM. After that, we'll have Inderjeet Parmar, on the right over there, who's professor of international politics at City University of London and a visiting professor at the LSE. He is also author of the forthcoming book, Presidents and Premiers at War. And then finally, we'll have Nancy McDermott, who's a researcher and writer who regularly comments on women and the family and American politics, and she is author of the forthcoming book, The Problem with Parenting. Dr. Albena.
The surprising rise of AOC and the gang was a clear blow to the neoliberal consensus politics that the center-left and the center-right had engineered in the past 30 years. Basically, disagreement on economic policy had vanished. There was an agreement among the main players that capitalism is the only game in town. So people who ventured to vote against that, both people or for any maverick candidates who deviated from that consensus, be it Trump or AOC, they risked and they knew that they were wasting their vote. So the very fact that vote was cast is telling of something. It's telling of something I like to call that people exercise their right to politics, their right to have their grievance enter the political space and be taken seriously. Basically, this is I don't know if it is a socialist position, it is certainly being labeled as a revival of socialism. It is clearly an anti-capitalist position. And it is not the good old socialist position because AOC has launched the Green New Deal. Now, the Green New Deal combines concerns with environmental justice and concerns with poverty, with social justice that have for a long time been at loggerheads. The Green Agenda has been, since it emerged in the 1960s, has been opposed not just by businesses, but also by the workers who are employed by those polluting businesses, the businesses that destroy the environment. So there has always been a very strong capital-labor alliance against the environment that these new forces in Europe and America are facing. Now, the issue is how to break that capital-labor alliance against the environment. And it seems to me that the radical left in the US and in Europe is doing it in the wrong way, and this is by resurrecting the old idea of the class struggle in their discourse, in their narratives, their criticism of inequality and tax the rich or vilify the rich. Why this is the wrong way to go? Because in order to mobilize social forces to do something both for social justice and for environmental justice, you need a very powerful, very broad alliance of forces. Every idea is only as strong as the social forces behind it. So in order to push for the Green New Deal, we need a very broad alliance. And fighting inequality or resurrection of some sort of a class struggle is not going to create this broad alliance of forces. I'll stop here because this is my take on AOC.
Sure. Kate?
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to start with, I guess, some positives around AOC and reasons that I see her climbing to the top so quickly in terms of certainly social media followers and fame. And I've already said it. The first really is that she has come to the forefront in a relatively new age for social media. And I think a lot of us have just taken for granted now that your social media game has to be pretty good in order to be successful in politics. But let's not forget that in America specifically, Barack Obama, our last president, was really the first politician to break through on this front. What he was doing was thought to be very innovative and brand new. So she's not all that far behind. So I think she's really capitalized in the age of social media, where a lot of her older opposition or counterparts will just not be as well on their game in that area. I'll come back to social media, though, because I think it's been a bit misleading in terms of her actual popularity. Another reason I think she's been very successful is because she taps into many serious unresolved issues for Americans. For all Americans, she taps into the issue of healthcare, something that the Republicans and Democrats have been promising to solve for decades now, and neither's come through on it. Obamacare has become slightly more popular since it came in, but still really is not popular for a lot of young people. It's cheaper to pay a tax to not get healthcare. It's cheaper to essentially pay the penalty fee to not get healthcare than it was to actually buy healthcare. It didn't make it all that more affordable, especially if you were in that gray middle class area. So she's really tapping into that. And especially for younger people, but I would say that pretty much in America goes up to the age of 45 now, she's tapped into the issue of student debt. So many young people feel like they've been gypped by the system, which, you know, is very unique in America, where you can graduate from university $250,000 in debt. People don't feel they're getting the education they deserve for that cost. They don't think it's fair. They can't see any situation they can get out of it. So she's tapped into that as well. And of course, she's a talented speaker, and she's representing diversity in lots of different ways, being a young woman, unmarried, an ethnic minority, in a time where, especially going up against the Republicans, they just haven't shown that same level of diversity. 41 of the 53 GOP senators are white men, for example. Now, that's not making a particular comment about that, good or bad, but when you look at the diversity of the American people and our immigration patterns as well, she's definitely tapping into something that a lot of people can resonate with, because they just don't see people who look or sound like them in politics. And I think plenty on the right are intimidated by her because they don't really know what to do with her. She's new, she's interesting, and they don't know how to combat her. All that being said, I think we have overestimated her popularity. So if we look at her district, the 14th district in New York where she won with 78% of the vote. Sounds huge, but that is very comparable and in line with the Democrats before her who won that district. It's a very, very left-wing district. The man that she beat, her margin for beating him wasn't anywhere near as impressive. It was about 57% to his 43%, around there. He had won that district previously with over 80% of the vote. So I don't think how well she did in that district reflects what's happening in the rest of America. And if we look at the midterm elections last year, we saw that it was actually the moderate wing of the Democratic Party that won the House back for the Democrats. There were a few more radicals that got in, a few more on further to the left, but actually it was that huge wave of centrist and moderate Democrats that won the heart of America, essentially, and won over those swing districts. So while she's doing very well on social media and she's very popular in her district, it's not obvious that her policies would directly translate to the rest of the country, where they are suggesting that something slightly more moderate could prevail. There's been a lot of criticisms of people treating her like a kid, like she doesn't know what she's doing. I'm sure that some of that is rooted in who she is and a bit of sexism, but I also think that on many accounts you could just say it's correct because she gets a lot of stuff wrong. On her 60-minute interview, she was called out for claiming that the Pentagon wasted $21 trillion, which could pay for 2/3 of her Medicare for All plan to provide Americans with universal access to health care, a figure that was just wildly wrong and misleading. And when she was called out on it, her response was that she thought that her critics were not seeing the forest through the trees, why they were questioning why she didn't understand why people were so concerned with facts and stats over what was morally right. And of course, this position I do think is immature and can justify just about any position you'd want in the world. If you're basically going to say facts and stats don't matter at all, I can get things completely wrong, but I have moral superiority. Well, you know, good luck to you justifying any position with that, but you more or less could. You know, she's gone on to say that, you know, everyone in America has 2 jobs. In reality, it's under 5% of the American working population that does. She's made inaccurate comments about the ICE, about how they're under obligation to detain 34,000 people an evening to fill beds. Now, I'm actually sympathetic to her on the immigration arguments. I believe in a more liberal immigration system, but she was completely wrong about that. So she's bringing on a lot of criticism, I think because she's new to it, but also because she doesn't actually seem to want to root herself in the facts as much. She's very much pandering to that far left moral superiority kind of angle. And I'm not convinced at all that it's going to play with the heart of America. I also think that her Green New Deal stuff, which would make it, you know, she's been very open about the fact it would make it more expensive to fly, more expensive to consume meat, also does not play with the working classes of America, who might only be able to afford that one vacation every few years or so. And she's certainly not a darling of the DNC or the moderate Democrats in the House right now. So her rise is impressive. In the age of social media, I don't find it all that surprising. But whether or not her ideas can actually translate into the heart of the Democratic Party remains to be seen. And I think that's where the real struggle will be.
I think I take quite a bit from what the previous speaker just said, but I'd like to sort of step back a little bit from AOC and the squad and to kind of look at the broader development, which they may be just the very kind of a tip of a spear of. I think, in my mind, it is a major development in the United States and a shift in American ideological identity. America is a country about which people have written books with the title, Why Is There No Socialism in the United States? And now what we have is quite a number of important signals about the rise of socialism, or what is called socialism. It may mean many different things, but certainly many people are calling themselves socialists. So, for example, YouGov, at the behest of a very anti-communist organization for the last 3 years, has carried out a surveys of opinion, particularly among millennials. That is, the people under the age of around, 35, 40, and down to about 18. And there are about 83 million such people in the United States. And this year's survey has just come out last week, and it found that 70% of millennials are likely to, or they're claiming they're likely to vote socialist in the upcoming elections. In 2018, the Council of Economic Advisors to the White House issued a report about the spectre of socialism in the United States. And the little preface at the beginning of that report said something like, 200 years since the birth of Karl Marx, 1818, the spectre of socialism is haunting the United States. And then it's a major annihilation of the whole idea of socialism, given the kind of character of the report that it was. So I would say that you can root this development in a number of ways, most immediately in the 2016 election campaign. Not only on the left, or at least in the Democratic Party with Bernie Sanders, but also within the Republican Party. President Trump, who became President Trump, candidate Trump, campaigned very heavily on a very pro-working class kind of politics and social policy and so on, claiming that he was going to redistribute power towards the ordinary working people, away from the elites. And that anti-elitism was previously something which the left largely monopolized, but it was used by Trump in order to win support away from corporate Republicans. And obviously the conflict within the Democratic Party with Bernie Sanders representing a kind of class-based politics as well. And both of them challenged in their own way corporate power's legitimacy and the legitimacy of big money in American party politics, such that both parties had become dominated by corporate donations, that the vast majority of money paid into the DNC and the Republican Party as well was coming from a very, very tiny proportion of the population, most linked with the big corporations themselves. But there was yet a deeper kind of a malaise, if you like, in regard to American power, its authority and legitimacy at home, but also its authority and legitimacy internationally, from the Iraq War through Libya, through the, in addition to other foreign policy interventions, Guantanamo as a source of major loss of moral authority in the United States, of the United States in the world, and then combined with the 2008 financial crash and the Great Recession that followed, and which then led to and fueled a galloping social inequality and increased levels of homelessness and poverty and loss of homes and so on, all of that combined in a way to create the pre-Sanders 2016 movements, the Tea Party on the right, which helped birth Donald Trump with his birtherist movement, but also the Occupy Wall Street movement, which gave a big boost to the left as well. So there are very large-scale kind of political effects of these deeper tendencies. And the United States is not alone in the kind of volatility of its politics, the rise of the right or the left, unusual in many countries more recently. It's a worldwide phenomenon. It seems to be linked with a broader kind of global globalization, if you like, of the world economy, world society, and so on, which has very large-scale effects. And it's not just socialists. There's the brand new Congress, which is an anti-party or a non-party movement, asking people from Republican backgrounds, as well as Democratic ones, but who've never stood for a particular party's elections before, and standing a lot of candidates in the next election coming up. So what you've got is a large amount of discontent with party politics as established, focused around big corporate money and big money politics in general. So I would argue that this is quite an interesting movement in the United States. There's a growing polarization of left and right, and I suspect that this polarization is going to continue. I would argue that there are a number of promises and a number of perils which the squad may be representing. I would say that it represents, to some extent, a new hope of reform and a challenge to corporate power. The fact that you have people who call themselves socialists or are very critical and they're in the Congress means you can question people who are brought up at hearings or investigations far more strongly, far more critically than you may otherwise do, because you're not at the behest of big corporate money itself. So Zuckerberg's interrogation very recently is an interesting indication of that. They've also challenged the power of the corporate money to the DNC, the Democratic National Committee as well, and put a new energy behind a kind of anti-Trump movement by saying that ICE ought to be abolished, that the racist and misogynistic tropes of his administration need to be challenged very militantly. They've also brought attention to the Palestinian cause and the role of Israel in that area. So I would say there are a number of promises that they show and a number of things that they've done which are very kind of important steps forward in my view. But at the same time, they are targets for, they have a number of perils. They're a target not only for the Trump campaign, because in a way, being women of color, being women, being socialists, self-identified, it's almost back to 1919 and the Red Scare, where an alien ideology with alien bodies was being exported or imported into the United States, and it was like a virus or whatever, and that's the way in which he's projecting the entire Democratic Party now. So in a way, it focuses his message in a particular direction. That's not so important as the fact that the DNC, the Pelosi's and others, have also targeted this particular group of people as well, largely as anti-Semitic and so on. So I would argue that that's one major thing. But the biggest problem I think they face is that the character of their politics is very much parliamentary, is very much congressional. They are not linked to a mass movement. They have say very little about the strikes at GM and Ford and other places. They are not linked to a large-scale workers' movement at all. And I think that means they're going to become isolated within parliamentary politics. And the great thing about the party system in the US, and I don't say that because it's a good thing, But one of the greatest things about their longevity is their ability to swallow up third-party movements or insurgent movements within their own parties and to domesticate them. So my own suggestion would be that what we're likely to see is some greater criticism, but a likely absorption of this kind of political trend into the kind of dominant politics that they are currently against, because they will be largely incorporated and domesticated by it. Thank you.
Nancy.
AOC is interesting because she really kind of embodies some of the problems with American politics right now. The 2016 election shows that we really have, not just in the U.S. but internationally, we've really entered a new phase of politics where the bankruptcy of established parties is really exposed. Just the hollowness of the Democratic Party and also the Republican Party, which is one reason why Trump was able to come in and to come out of nowhere and take the nomination and become president. And in a similar way, AOC really came out of nowhere and has been able to, suddenly become be talked about as the face and the future of the Democratic Party. And the thing that strikes me about AOC is just the superficiality of and the hype around AOC and around the what she supposedly represents. I mean, I agree with a lot of what's been said about her constituency really not being the people she's representing in New York, but really being sort of a creation of Twitter. Her constituency is social media, but I disagree with the idea that she represents anything more than just a sort of attempt by the Democratic Party to find a new way of modernizing itself and of appealing to younger people. I mean, it's striking to me that if you talk to normal people about her, she's not all that popular with working class people. She's not all that popular with the man on the street. But the people who she is really popular with are Democratic Party activists, particularly middle-aged women, kind of based in the suburbs, who think that she's absolutely just wonderful, and represents the future of the Democratic Party. And I think that we need to be very skeptical about the idea that she represents really anything to do with a genuine opposition, because essentially, if you look at what she's putting forward, I don't think she's actually speaking to the concerns of the majority of the American public. I think what she articulates what Democratic activists think are the concerns of the American people. So, for example, if you take some of the things that she's put forward, the Green New Deal, for example, I mean, what she doesn't appreciate is that the Green New Deal would put a lot of people out of work. It's anti-growth, it's anti-consumption, and those are things that, if we really wanted to revitalize the American economy and be able to create a future that could appeal to people beyond the elite, that's something that you would need to pay attention to. I guess the frustrating thing is that the good thing about AOC is that it shows that politics can be unpredictable, and that it is possible for someone who is outside the establishment to be able to come in and to be able to establish themselves. But the problem with it is that she still doesn't really represent the voice of mainstream America, and it's frustrating because it's like you can see the potential for something new in her, but you can also see that that the majority of people don't really have a voice, and that what's being put forward as their or what she's being portrayed at is not really something that would appeal to the majority of Americans. I think I'm going to leave it there.
Great, thanks. So we'll come out to the audience now for questions, disagreements, comments.
So, is there any prospect of AOC being the next kind of in the next generation? Obviously, not the upcoming round of elections, but in the future, do the panel think there's any possibility of that being the future of the Democratic Party?
Thanks. And yeah.
Josh, Nico, forgive me because I'm a layman when it comes to US politics, but what seems to characterize where we are now and predates Trump is this extreme partisanship, and more so even than we see in the UK and other countries. And why aren't we seeing from the Democrats figures like the Republican Brant Fitzpatrick, who has sponsored a bill, a bipartisan bill on the carbon tax, and an effort to understand those concerns of Midwest voters and others that led to the defeat in 2016.
I just wanted to sort of draw a comparison between AOC and Trump. Interestingly, Mike Senovich and Scott Adams, two people that often talk about persuasion, really rate Trump and actually forecast his election victory years out. They have the same opinion of AOC. They think she's absolutely a superstar. I mean, the fact that we're here in London talking about a congresswoman is remarkable. I don't think there's any MP in Britain who would be talked about in America. Maybe the Prime Minister, at best, with people who have an interest in British politics. And so while she doesn't have a movement in the same classical sense of the unions and factory stuff, nor did Trump. So that's not necessarily a blocker for success. I mean, I'm skeptical of her ability to appeal to middle America, but she could actually be potentially in 20 years' time the Democratic candidate for presidency on the basis of just her persuasion, because no one really cares about facts at the margins. I actually think it's all about direction of travel and how people feel. No one's sitting there going about the Green New Deal, going, oh well, look at all this technical stuff. We don't have enough engineers. No one's making that comment. You either instinctively think it's a load of rubbish, or you instinctively think it's really good. And she actually manages to frame that in a really positive way. So I think she is potentially, a megastar.
I want to pick up on the point that she's not speaking for middle America, and maybe if you could talk more about that a little bit. Is it the issues that she's selected? Is it her style? Is it the fact that she's still pretty young and it's not really focused on details at this point? Because it seems like the issues themselves could be framed, and in fact are being framed by some of the more middle-of-the-road candidates as crucial to America. She's talking about healthcare, she's talking about the environment, she's talking about the economy. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, is this a matter of style? Is it a matter of her newness and her approach? Is it a reaction to her, and will that change over time, or is it a reaction to the issues she's selecting?
Thanks. And
so there's been an emerging kind of reaction from mainly right-wing voters and governments to characterize environmentalists as being part of watermelon politics. So this concept that environmentalists are green on the outside and red on the inside. So they're using environmentalism as a kind of mechanism to smuggle socialist concerns through into policy. Is there a danger that by explicitly linking the two in the Green New Deal, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is actually feeding into stereotypes and concepts like that, and actually devaluing the nature of her environmental message by associating it explicitly with socialism?
thanks. I'll come to the panel now.
Well, on the question of middle America, mean, I think the problem is, or part of the problem is that AOC is essentially her politics are essentially identity politics, and I think that that's not enough to unite the country. I mean, you have to have something that is not based on who you are, but that can articulate a vision of where you want to go, and that has something for everyone. And that's a weakness that is kind of widespread throughout the Democratic Party. It's not just AOC; she's just the perky face of it. And I think I can't prove this, but just in talking to people and to I just get the sense that there is potential for something else, because people are kind of desperate. They do want something different, and I think that the problem is that what AOC is, for most people, it's just more of the same. It's more identity politics. It's policies that they're presented as if these, of course, these should appeal to you, but they don't really, because people have more pressing concerns.
Thanks. Kate?
I think the comparison between Trump and AOC is really good. She was a bartender, he was a multimillionaire real estate mogul, but they were both political outsiders that really don't fit into the parties that they've come to dominate, at least in terms of the narrative, right? AOC has not taken over the Democratic Party in the way that Donald Trump has the Republican Party, but the narrative and the media around it, that sort of, that debate that's happening, they've both been hugely influential in. And they're both benefiting from the age of social media, where you can say things like fake news and alternative facts and get away with it. I think they both fundamentally lack substance, where this is already proving difficult for Trump, and I think will prove more difficult for AOC down the line, is that if you don't have that substance, or you don't get it really quick, people start to see through you. And because she's come in at age 29, Trump actually came in when he became president of the United States, which is, extremely rare thing to happen. There's a lot more time to pick holes in her narrative. In terms of being the future of the Democratic Party, a lot of that depends on where it goes. But as I said, it was the moderates in 2018 who brought the House back for the Democrats. And if you look at those key swing states, which haven't changed all that dramatically in decades now, although 2016 was a big upset, and you look at areas like Florida, which has, say, a lot of social conservatives, or you now look at areas like the Rust Belt that has a lot of working class people scared to lose their jobs. I would argue that in terms of being the future, the swing areas that matter in elections do not favor AOC. So if we were to ever move away from the Electoral College, which I personally hope we don't, and move to a popular vote, maybe then, in California and New York, turning out the vote for AOC might prove very fruitful. But in terms of sending her to rural Pennsylvania to talk about the Green New Deal and how it's really important that we take away these people's jobs overnight to save the planet, even if you think that is the solution, that doesn't win votes. So unless she gets more substance or is able to figure out a more holistic way to paint her vision that's more inclusive to those people, it's not obvious to me at all that she would be the future.
Thanks. Inderjeet?
I think if we focus the discussion entirely on Cortez, I think we end up then talking only about the politics of a particular personality. And I would say that if we talked about, say, the politics of Bernie Sanders, I think we might get a better idea about the power of this kind of leftward drift towards a kind of regulated capitalism. It's not even social democracy in the European sense. It doesn't go into nationalization, state ownership, and that kind of thing. But when we look at, say, Bernie Sanders and the impact he had in 2016 and has had since, and how that's impacted on Elizabeth Warren, so I think we get an idea about what a candidate who may not be very attractive to so-called middle America, which I would challenge as a concept, because I'm not sure there is any middle left in the United States anymore, that what we've got is a very large amount of discontent with Republican voters saying they would be happy to vote for a candidate like Sanders should they have a straight up choice. So what you've got is a very deep problem of legitimacy in the United States. AOC happens to be one particular individual. Whether or not she has a future in the party in the next 10, 20, 30 years, nobody can tell. But the fact that she has been elected, the fact that she has quite a following, the fact that Bernie Sanders has blazed a trail for the last several years, I think it's had a broader effect on the politics of the broader left. And I think that's what we need to be looking out for. But the peril of that movement is it is a movement of the elite plus a few more. It's not a movement of ordinary working people which has any traction. So even when you look at the politics of Sanders, he can go to Detroit or somewhere nearby a car factory and not even mention the fact that the GM workers, 49,000 of them, have been on strike for several weeks. And I think that is the big problem. They're not linked. And in that regard, AOC, Sanders and others part company with Donald Trump. Donald Trump, for all his other problems and issues and whatever, the fact is he has a big connection with people right in the heartlands of right around the country. His rallies still draw a large number of people. He is actually trying to build an extra parliamentary movement, which I think he wants to continue much further on. He is from slightly outside of the political elite, and I think he's trying to build a different kind of base. My view is the AOCs and others could take a leaf out of that book and actually build a broader movement as well, because otherwise they're going to be domesticated. So she could end up as leader of the Democratic Party in 20 years' time, but I guarantee you whatever she has of class politics will have disappeared. Her identity politics will be right top, front and centre, and she'll be part of the polarization which we've already seen, of a kind of white identity nationalism and the rest of America, and a kind of rump Republican Party with against an identity-oriented Democratic Party, which will not satisfy a large number of people whose economic position is so bad and seems to be getting worse.
Thank you. Albena?
Yes, I just want to maybe correct something that Inderjeet said, that AOC is a sign of the polarization of left and right in the US. Seems to be that actually the polarization is between the far left and far right on the one side, or the periphery on the one side, and the center on the other, because there is more common between AOC and Trump than between AOC and Nancy Pelosi. So what is interesting that's going on there is that there is a discontent on the fringes of society versus those who have been profiting and continue to profit from, the corporate investment in politics. So the problem is to, what to do with that polarization, which is not represented in any party positions. And then the big mark of AOC and Sanders is to have shifted not only the discourse of the Democratic Party to the left, but also the whole political spectrum more to the left. As we hear more and more Republican voices concerned with the cost of education, with the cost of healthcare, with even gun control. So there has been an impact on the whole political set of concerns that are addressed by parties. And so hats off to this. About the red and the green, that's very tricky. And all the green parties are aware that they're alienating electorates with a costly green agenda, because as in the kind of the workerist left, people often say there is just one worse thing than to be exploited, and this is not to be exploited. So the concern with jobs is a very real one. And when the AOC, we read in the Green New Deal that this deal is going to bring unprecedented prosperity, although it is very clearly that we don't have the means, the know-how, the technology to produce our life cheaper, it is just not plausible for the electorate to be, and people are not stupid, and they do not need to be told these big promises. I think that AOC and you know all the people pushing for the Green New Deal, they should stop promising the impossible, and then they would be more plausible, because that agenda is extremely important. How to bridge ecological justice with social justice. This is really what we need to be discussing, and this is not going to be done with empty promises of equality and prosperity forever increasing.
Thanks. I've got a quick question for anyone on the panel, or a few of you. Kind of, to what extent the US presidential primary right now, the Democrat primary, tells you about any appetite for the left or kind of more left-wing politics among Democrat voters? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but Biden is still the leading candidate in the Democratic primary right now, which is to go against this idea that Democrat voters are more open to left-wing politics.
It's shifting a bit. So Biden has been leading, but people like Elizabeth Warren, especially in key states like Iowa and New Hampshire, have been in some polls taking the lead. Interestingly, Bernie Sanders doesn't seem like he's cutting through like he did last time. But Elizabeth Warren has adopted a lot of the further left-wing rhetoric, a lot of Trump's rhetoric around economic nationalism and essentially protectionism, anti-globalization. I think what the Democratic primary is telling us right now is that people like AOC have had some influence, but the more interesting question is what the general election will tell us between a candidate, say, like Warren and Trump, or Biden and Trump, and whether or not there is genuine appetite from people who aren't that politically engaged, but as you say, aren't dumb, and know if they're being promised fantasies or truth, and which direction they go in.
Thanks. If anyone else wants to pick up on anything there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure how useful left and right are in understanding American politics right now. I think the point's been made a couple of times that, you know, when AOC talks about socialism, that, we're not really talking about socialism. We're talking about, we're talking about national health. It's as if Britain were socialist, which it's not. It's not substantial. And a lot of the people who call themselves socialists now, you talk to them, and it's very moralistic. It's not really based on anything more than that. But I think that the interesting thing about the primary is just how sewn up it is. So you get a candidate like Tulsi Gabbard, who I think is interesting because I have talked to a lot of people across the political spectrum who say, yeah, I kind of like her. And because I think she's somebody who's articulating something that's not identity politics, that is a return to a sort of centrist way of looking at things. But you can see how she's being attacked by the Democratic Party establishment, and it just gives you a sense of how you still have these power structures in place that are just very difficult to break through. And it's interesting because I think, just to go back to AOC for a minute, it's interesting the conflict between the squad and between somebody like Pelosi, because Pelosi is someone who's been in the Senate for years and years and really does wield power in a kind of way, getting things done, because it's an art, and she's had a lot of experience in it. But the fact that she can't just put AOC and the squad in their place and just control the agenda just shows that that there is a bigger problem for the Democrats and a lot more potential for instability.
Thanks. Comment from Inderjeet, and then we'll come out to the audience after.
Yeah, with the primaries. Just kind of looking at it from outside, candidate Biden has a very large, he may be still in the lead and hanging on by his fingertips, but he is losing the confidence even of Wall Street. And this is a guy who comes from Delaware, where there's about 1 million corporations paying no tax, and he has been the champion of that kind of thing pretty much the whole of his career. He's got so many problems and he ain't seen nothing yet. Because if he is adopted as a candidate, not only is he losing corporate money in terms of donations towards his campaign, his son, Hunter Biden, and that job he had with Burisma in Ukraine, a job for which he had no qualifications, and the corruption that kind of sort of washes around Mr. Biden, I think that's going to come to the fore a great deal. The problem is, however, even if Sanders or Warren, I think, were to win the nomination, we go back to 2016 and what happened to Sanders when he lost the nomination. He put everything behind Hillary Clinton. And I think this tells us a great deal about the nature of the Democratic Party and of the two main parties in general. That is, they do have a number of maverick or even unconventional, unorthodox, interesting kinds of candidates, sometimes representing more than just a maverick individual, but they're very, very good at domesticating them and then mobilizing them behind the party itself. And in a way, the AOCs and the squads and so on, they are irritants to the Democratic leadership, but they are also hoovering up large numbers of votes because it says, if you've lost faith in the two main party leaderships, you've still got these kinds of people in part of the party, and they are doing a very good job in that regard. So I suspect that whoever wins the nomination, they're going to go much further to the center and probably further to the right in order to compete with President Trump. And that's the problem of this kind of politics in itself.
Thanks. So we'll go out to the audience again.
Yeah, some people have heard me plug it already, but I'm giving a session at 10 o'clock tomorrow on the Green New Deal. But since it's been mentioned so much in relation to AOC, I felt I have to say something about it, because if you look at the Green New Deal, you don't need to go into great detail to see it's not some kind of humane exercise for prosperity and perhaps a few West Virginia coal miners will suffer. It's an absolute exercise in imposing huge austerity on the American people. So AOC has done this cartoon written by Avi Lewis, which shows her in 20 years' time, and it puts the Green New Deal in a very positive light. All these people have got jobs, retrofitting houses, and it's all a nice, clean environment. It all seems really good. But if you read something written on this, if you read, for example, Naomi Klein's book, and Naomi Klein is married to Avi Lewis, who wrote the script for this AOC documentary, cartoon, so very closely related. It's absolutely clear, many, many times in the book, what it talks about is the need to cut consumption. In other words, the need to cut the living standards of American people. And the only way she can claim it's a pro-prosperity agenda is by redefining prosperity to mean something else other than consumption. So yes, if you want to, you can say, yes, I think austerity is a good thing. You can make that argument. But I don't think you can legitimately make the argument that the Green New Deal is a positive way forward that will bring prosperity for the American people, because the only way it will do that is by some kind of conjuring trick where you redefine prosperity to mean something entirely different, to mean its opposite.
So AOC, the squad, Sanders in general, I think generally represents sort of a paradigm shift in the Democratic Party, at least, in the fact that it's starting to split. I think generally the two-party system in America isn't super representational of the entire political spectrum in general. Just within each party, you have massive libertarian and authoritarian sects, and that's just within just the up-down, ignoring the fact that the Democratic Party really goes center-right all the way to extreme left, so you have huge splits there. So I'm just sort of wondering, how can the fact that far-left candidates are starting to actually get some level of success, are able to start influencing the actual, at least sections of the Northeast and the West Coast, but are having a hard time in the Midwest and sort of Middle America, if it exists, what does that say about the future of the Democratic Party and subsequently later on the Republican Party as it's also starting to split? Are they going to be able to sort of survive that, or are the parties themselves going to start having to split overall?
I wasn't going to say anything until Kate mentioned rural Pennsylvanians, and I'm a rural Pennsylvanian, so I think it's only my job to. AOC does really represent something absurd. In many ways, she's the Democratic Party version of Sarah Palin. We get these political pinup girls who, generally speaking, don't go much farther than that. And then Nancy mentioning Tulsi Gabbard, who is all substance in addition to whatever she brings to the table. But what I do find particularly egregious about what's happened is how much the media has framed AOC as a budding superstar while they destroyed Sarah Palin for having essentially the same lack of substance and knowledge of how things work. It was particularly galling to see her just grilling Zuckerberg, was it last week, where she absolutely had first of all, she wouldn't let the man speak, number one. Number two, she kept asking him questions that had nothing to do with Facebook's place in social media. And then you look back and see what happens to Palin. Tina Fey essentially destroyed Sarah Palin as a public figure. You can't look at Sarah Palin any longer without seeing Tina Fey doing her little preening around the stage. And yet, Saturday Night Live doesn't touch AOC. In fact, they've made it very clear that Democratic politics are off the table, and yet Alec Baldwin is on every week playing the role of President Trump. It's pretty remarkable, and yet the similarities there are absolute, in my mind at least. In many ways, the only thing that makes AOC remotely democratic is, and this is what Daniel was saying, the only thing about her that connects her to the Democratic Party is that how ban happy it is. I mean, every debate, every conversation with the Democratic part of this primaries is they each tries to out-ban the other. Right? The Republicans want to deregulate everything. The Democrats want to ban everything. And there's Tulsi Gabbard in the middle saying, can we please have an adult moment here? And nobody wants to say, they want to defend her against the slights and whatever it was that Hillary Clinton said about her. But as far as the substance of what she's saying, what's fascinating about the Democrats and why the only reason that AOC would be a Democrat is because of the banning. I think the gentleman over here was right. There really is too much going on. There's too many divisions to have parties, have American politics represented by two parties any longer. And I think this is part of the problem, is that we can't seem to find out where the different positions on the political spectrum lie.
So, based on what the panel was saying, it seems that Cortez draws from a middle class identity, middle class environmentalist kind of discourse, and from the middle classes rather than from the working classes. That looks to me like what's happening with the Corbyn movement, who, after the recent Labour conferences, it's clear that he has abandoned the working class and its democratic decision making, and it's drawing on the middle class cosmopolitan London crowd. And if that happens, if that is also the way that the American left is going towards, then we are talking about abandonment of the working classes, and which makes them vulnerable to the right, which we have evidence for that, as they've been drawn to Trump. Trump may win again as a response to the further abandoning of the working classes by the left, and that may very well happen, I think, in the next general election here in the UK, when we see the results and the defeat of a Corbyn-led Labour Party, which I think will happen. So the issue is about the left abandoning the working class, and the working class being an easy target for the right.
Okay. Thanks. Obviously, panelists can come in on anything they want from that, but I was wondering, does anyone on the panel support AOC's Green New Deal? Because there's been lots of criticism of it. No?
No, I mean,
would anyone like to try and defend? Yeah.
Say anybody like? I think there's two things. One is the politics of the Green New Deal as something put forward by a lot of people in the Democratic Party, and you could go back to the 1930s and talk about the problems of the New Deal itself. But to deny the importance of climate change, to challenge that as a fundamental problem of our age, and then to see that it is in fact going to have to lead to major changes in the whole ideology of economic growth and of consumption, I think to deny all that is to deny a major problem which is objectively real. So that whether or not the Green New Deal actually is effective in doing very much about that is a secondary question to what seems to be an underlying problem, as expressed by some of the people speaking here, is that the whole idea of climate science is a problem. The fact is that it used to be called global warming until the mid-1990s, when various Republican strategists and wordsmiths began to try to shift the agenda away from that to what is now called climate change or climate science or whatever. So there are large numbers of people who are going to suffer from it. The big problem is not that there's going to be has to be a big change. The issue is, how do you manage the transition such that jobs which are involved in coal mining and many other fossil fuel industries, and big corporations which are making very large amounts of money out of that, how are we going to transition away from an economy like that towards one which is much more kind of sustainable and so on? So economic growth, consumption. The gentleman spoke about consumption and how this is an austerity measure. In the United States, about 40% of the population goes into financial crisis if a sudden $400 cost lands on their doorstep. We're talking about groups of people who are not consuming very much at all. So there's large numbers of people who have got a position in that society which is very precarious. That's the big problem here, is the construction of an economy for the future which deals with those sorts of people as well, and not for very big corporations like the Coke industries and others, which have been making very large amounts of money out of all this.
Thanks. You mentioned precarity, so that's something you've written a book about, Albena, so maybe it's something.
Yes, we were just coming to the idea that the Green New Deal, what I find is the error of the way the package is sold to the public is promising, is with the big promises. It's not with the reality of the issues it addresses. So what my concern is simply that there is so much over-promising of prosperity, and this is based on the belief that people insist on that prosperity. At least my work, my research that went into my new book, which is coming out in December, is that, and I have looked at interviews with the Yellow Vests protesters, the concerns are not with being middle class and affluent and taking your exotic vacations. Concerns us with precarity. So as long as people's lives are stable, they would accept sacrifices in order to address issues with climate change. The Yellow Vests, this has been consistently their response, that we do care about the environment. The issue is with the precariousness of our lives. So my advice would be to shift away from promising prosperity and focusing on fighting precarity. There are resources for that, and that's a big shift.
Thanks. Nancy?
Well, I think one of the frustrating things is that not just the U.S. economy, but all of our economies do need to be restructured, and we do need to come up with different forms of energy. We need to revitalize our industry. We need to create the basis for people to have a future. And the problem with the Green New Deal and with a lot of these critiques is that they're very moralistic. And what it ends up being, it ends up being a sort of thing that is imposed on people. So it's like the world is burning, and you should care about this without actually appealing to people and giving them a way that they can see that this is a way, this needs to be done, not just about climate change, but about revitalizing our lives and our future, and it needs to be done together. I mean, the issues with the American economy are so serious that there is absolutely no way that you can solve them without the cooperation and the knowledge and the commitment of the American people. You can't just, kind of come and impose these solutions on people, especially if it's, if it's going to hurt them, and expect them to go along with it. I mean, right now, there's a serious situation with cities collapsing, and people are desperately trying to kind of keep them going, and will go to extraordinary lengths to try and preserve their lives, and to have a future in the places that they live, and it's being completely ignored by mainstream politicians, so not only does the Green New Deal not address any of that, but it actually becomes a sort of stick to beat people with, I think, and I really think it's unlikely that it has the appeal to make anyone beyond the elite really support it.
Thanks. We've got about 10 minutes left, so kind of quickly, then we'll go back out to the audience.
Sure. Well, I was just going to put in a bit of skepticism here around sort of polling about what people will and will not accept. So, if you say, well, if people's lives are more stable, then, they'll accept certain sacrifices. Well, let's put it to them. If it has to be through control, if it has to be through a top-down approach, if it has to be through banning things, let's actually put it to them. And let's not forget that the reason that these big corporations that do pollute make a lot of money is because normal people are buying their products. They're buying cars. They're flying on planes. They're doing all kinds of activity, which does increase consumption and increases living standards, but does have trade-offs. We need to talk about trade-offs in all of these circumstances. And I don't support the Green New Deal because there's no discussion of trade-offs. It is all about what they're going to ban, what they're going to tax, which is always going to be regressive in principle and have the biggest impact on the poorest group of people. And it's almost as if giving them back some kind of moral prosperity, saying, well, you are worse off, you're poorer because we haven't actually accounted for any of these trade-offs, but you can feel good about yourself, probably isn't quite good enough, especially not for the American people where, they've grown up with the philosophy that you should do better than your parents, you will be richer than your parents, and if you're not, something's gone badly wrong. And just really quickly, because there's been a lot of chat about sort of the split in the major parties. And this has been going on for a long time. I mean, it's not just AOC. We saw the rise of Ron Paul, who was a libertarian within the Republican Party, who was hugely successful in bringing young people into that movement. But never underestimate tribal politics. And I think what we saw in 2016 is that for all the disgust with Trump on the right and for all the frustrations with Hillary Clinton on the left, voters came home. They came back to the party that they registered to in really, really big blocks. And I'm not one to usually talk about rigged political systems because I actually think that's usually an excuse to say, I don't like that the other person won. Let me come up with reasons why they did. But the American system does have an issue that it is very difficult for third parties to have their voices heard in any meaningful way. And a lot of the rules are built in so that those people struggle to get a platform. And that is something I think on the left and right now you could probably find consensus for addressing.
Thanks. So we're going to very quickly come back out to the audience.
I really agree with the point that Albena made, and I think it's a real problem about the magical thinking around the Green New Deal, but around a lot of policies where you confront, people can confront a kind of a contradiction in their political appeal. They say, oh, well, look, if we solve the climate thing, it's going to lead to austerity. And then somebody in a room says, well, look, let's just kind of reverse this discourse and say, let's pretend that the austerity measures that we envisage as necessary to confront the climate problem will be the opposite, and that somehow that retrofitting my insulation is going to create more jobs. It's not. I mean, there's a kind of it may be that in a sort of 70-year time frame you could see a kind of massive transformation of energy production, but in a 20-year time frame there's only two possibilities. Either you don't fix the environment and you have growth, or you do fix the environment and you have severe disruption of the economy. So I think the Extinction Rebellion position is more honest, is that if what we're saying about climate change is right, that's going to be a profound disruption of the economy. If they're exaggerating, and that you could have a much a gentler transformation, it's a long time doing.
Alex Dean, the panel has made the argument that the perceived extremes, Trump and AOC, have more in common than the moderates in between them. That's happened in our country, but not in Westminster, but in Northern Ireland, where Ian Paisley on the one hand and Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams on the other basically totally destroyed and absorbed the UUP, who were the moderate side on the Unionists, and the SDLP, who were the moderates under Sinn Féin. Now, of course, that was religious and nationalistic rather than otherwise, rather than the other kinds of identity politics, but it's still identity politics that made them the extremes. The difference in the comparison is that they then came together on common ground for a peace deal, and in Northern Ireland. And I suppose my question is there a peace deal between the extremes that you as a panel have identified? And if not, what does this kind of polarisation mean? If once you've eaten all the young on your own side, what does it mean once you've dominated your position enough to be the only animal in the room? What happens next?
You've all seemed to have identified there's not much support in the Middle America, if you will, for AOC and these ideas. So I was wondering, do you think that might change if some kind of crisis, either economic, environmental or other, could occur? Would a crisis start to push people towards these more radical ideas, or is that not something you envisage in the near future?
Thanks. So each of our panelists, you have about 1 minute each.
I thought it was a really good question about the extremes and identity politics. Is there a peace deal? I think if there is a peace deal, it'll probably be brought about by some sort of major crisis. That is a crisis which basically derives from whatever source, but which has such a profound effect that it unites people around their core concerns, which in the end, in my own mind, and with due respect for identity and the importance of identity politics, that in the end it's the way in which people live, how they earn their money, what kind of stability in their family lives, the possibility of a future with some sort of economic security, those kind of questions are fundamental. And they're fundamental to people who vote for both parties in practice. And I would think that somebody's talked about the disruptions of the Green New Deal and dealing with climate change. But the fact is this: the American economy, the American stock market, and quantitative easing is heading towards something pretty bad in the next few years, maybe worse than 2008. We're going to get that crisis as a result of some of the dynamics of financialization and the power of the financial groups to do more or less what they please, which they're now doing after being bailed out 10, 12 years ago. So there is a big crisis coming, and it could well be economic, financial, but it could be other as well, the polarization kind of based around race and culture. But there is a big crisis, or series of crises coming. A peace deal, it would have to be something which united people on the way in which their livelihoods are to be earned and gained, and their economic security to be assured.
Thanks.
I don't think it lies on the ground of identity politics.
Thanks. Nancy?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people there is already a crisis. It's just a crisis that hasn't been recognized by the whole of society, and I think that it's almost as if people are so desperate to have anyone listen and take their concerns seriously that, I mean, I really feel like that is what is behind Trump. Trump is not trying to build a movement. Trump is just saying, he's saying what people want to hear. And I think that there are a lot of people who don't particularly have a lot of faith in Trump, but he's the only person, the only politician who is actually acknowledged, that they are in crisis. And I think there's an untapped section of people who didn't vote for Trump, but are not happy with the Democrats either. And I think that if you could have, and I think you probably will have. I think there has to be an opposition that is not based on identity politics, that is based on a vision of America that pulls people together. I think there's so much potential for that. It's just hard to see where it would come from.
Thanks. Albena?
Just to clarify, the very interesting phenomenon that the people who voted for these minority women, they voted for them not because they were minority women, but because they were representing an anti-establishment position on economic policy. So there is a shift, in fact, from identity politics to economic policy. And that's a very welcome shift. So we'll see how far that will go, because the battle now, I mean, we see that very quickly both parties, the mainstreams of the both parties, are turning to the economy. So what would be left for the fringes? Would it be, again, this kind of a class struggle that they're resurrecting with the tax the rich discourse? Or would it be something more interesting, like fighting precarity for all?
Thank you. And Kate?
To the question about what could move people towards or further away from AOC's politics, rarely is it the case that these kinds of trends can rely on, just one moment or just one instance in history. But I actually think the way that the 2020 election pans out is going to matter a lot, because I think if somebody like Joe Biden becomes the nominee and he wins, I actually think we're going to go back to something much more normal looking in American politics. It doesn't mean that the AOCs will lose all traction, but I think they'll actually lose a lot, and we may, go back 15 or 20 years in terms of the way that things were going there. In terms to Alex's excellent question about a peace treaty, I think it's less likely to happen in America because our system almost already accounts for it, that we have this process of checks and balances in which someone can hold the most radical views in the world, and it doesn't mean that they get to sweep the nation with them. You already have this system brokered in, which isn't necessarily peaceful in political terms, but means that everything gets watered down more and more and more to the point where sometimes it's nearly impossible to do anything. Maybe in certain areas, like drug reform, people like Donald Trump and AOC could find a peace treaty, but I think the system itself allows for that watering down process to occur.
Thank you. Thanks to all panelists.